7 years ago, I had a conversation that became something of a personal obsession. To set some context at the time, my wife and I were expecting our first child. Now, for those of you who haven't yet been through the life experience of having your first child, if you live in London and you're middle class, this weird thing happens to you when you're expecting your first child. You join a cult. It's called the NCT, or National Childbirth Trust. And of course, it's not really a cult, but your life kind of changes and you get thrown together with this random set of other middle-class people who are equally as clueless as you in terms of what's coming. And there's your local chapter leader, who's this somewhat overzealous national kind of natural childbirth expert, who says, these are your new friends. And you're all thinking, well, life's not really going to change. And it was during the time meeting this crowd of new friends that I got to meet this guy called Darren Ashby. And I was told by my wife, don't be too Peter when you meet these people. They're our new friends. I knew exactly what she meant. And we did this kind of awkward, I've never been on a Tinder date, but I guess it was a kind of awkward Tinder date thing where we all got to know each other. And Darren said, I said, Darren, what is it you do? And he goes, I guess I'm an innovation consultant. I'm like, now, I worked in financial markets at the time, and consultant was a bit of a trigger word for me. And I said, what does that mean? And he said something to me that started this personal obsession. He said, I help the big companies compete with the small companies. I thought, I've never thought of it like that. I've always thought of it as the underdog being the small company, and yet he's like, no, we're helping the big companies actually compete with the small companies. And I've been thinking about this for the last kind of 7 years on and off, and spending time with a lot of companies who seem to have disrupted and grown. If there's one pattern for the last 15 years, it's been this story of kind of disruption. Almost every vertical has been massively disrupted. These small companies who start from seemingly nowhere seem to come in and challenge the giants and not stop there. Take Airbnb, it started out just helping you kind of couch surf, and it's changed the way we think about where we're going to stay when we travel. Take Amazon, which started shipping books. We heard earlier, now it's billions of dollars a year by doing all sorts of things, including just selling data. These massively disruptive companies are kind of the new norm. And so I've been thinking an awful lot and spending time with some of these companies to try and understand what is it about these companies that's different? Are there any common patterns that allow us to kind of understand kind of what allows them to consistently allow David to beat Goliath? A good example of this kind of interaction is Netflix versus Blockbuster. If you go back to 2004, Netflix was a tiny little company with almost no resources, and yet we see this pattern in almost every vertical. The kind of challenger comes and completely dominates kind of Blockbuster. Now, do you all remember Blockbuster? Not all of you, no. If we look at the timeline, it tells us a few things. So the first thing you learn from the timeline is actually Netflix is older than you think. It's older than some of you. It was actually started in 1997 as this weird little company that sent you videotapes and DVDs through the post. Its key value proposition was nothing to do with creating content or anything else. It was really solving one specific problem. That was that it was really annoying to go and take the tapes back. Right, at that time, people actually quite liked going to Blockbuster Video to choose what they were going to watch. They could pick up popcorn, and it was part of the whole ritual of having movie night. The annoying part of that was having to take it back, and if you forgot, these late fees suddenly got massive. That was how Netflix started. Its addressable market was actually pretty small. It was kind of movie buffs. No one would have predicted at that point that it would go on to have the impact that it's had in terms of how we think of and consume video content. 2000, two things happen. The first thing is that Netflix tries to sell themselves to Blockbuster Video for $50 million. And Netflix say, no, thank you. With hindsight, that must go down there with kind of Decca Records turning down the Beatles and Yahoo refusing to buy Google as the kind of biggest business mistakes of the last kind of century. Another thing happens too. Enron, who's a company that's not around anymore, watch a documentary if you haven't heard about them, ended spectacularly badly, partnered with Blockbuster in bringing about video streaming. Anyone who thinks that the reason some of these companies are successful is because they have the best ideas and they're first to market, hate to tell you, it's almost universally false. Back in 2000, Blockbuster and Enron already had the basis of the technology they needed to bring streaming video into people's homes. Now, at that point, Blockbuster made what were very rational decisions. They said, well, hey, there's not enough content that's available to stream. People don't really want it. This weird little Netflix company that's trying to sell it to us, that might disrupt our existing business. We like the fact that people come into stores because we can sell them popcorn. We make a fortune on that. These are all very rational decisions. And yet, as the years progress, we see that Netflix, 7 years later, introduces streaming. Actually, the catalog at the beginning of that was smaller than the catalog that Enron and Blockbuster might have had in 2000. Blockbuster has a few more attempts at kind of getting into the streaming, but at this point they're kind of panicking and trying to copy Netflix. And eventually, Blockbuster goes bust. But Netflix doesn't stop there. They've dominated this sector. This is where the chart on the previous slide finished, and they were roughly the same size as Blockbuster, but they've got a lot of energy, and they start creating new content. This is a different type of company. I often get asked, what's a tech company? I've had executives at agencies tell me that agencies need to be tech companies, and I think that's kind of the wrong framing, because it's not really about technology. There's a lot of tech companies, the IBMs and the Microsofts, who are kind of in the kind of industry of building software, and even they've been disrupted. I think a better framing is to think about these internet companies. There seems to be an era of internet companies that are not only able to kind of challenge and disrupt, but they continue to disrupt and they continue to innovate. And not only do they dominate categories, they create entire new ones. The first thing an internet company is a traditional company with a website in front of it. A lot of companies tried this, and they largely failed. To explain what I think an internet company is, I'm going to take you back to before the internet. Before the internet, this is what software looked like. We used to have to a lot of you won't even remember these. My God, I feel old. Right. This is what software looked like. As software engineers, we were in the industry of producing these things that came on disks and CDs or installed on hard drives. And the way that we went about building software was pretty straightforward. We gathered the requirements, we understood the problem. We designed a solution. We handed that solution over to some engineers who built it. We made sure it worked, and then we shipped it. Almost every kind of manufacturing process looks a bit like this. You start with understanding the problem, you design a solution, you kind of build it, you make sure it all works okay, and you get it out in front of people. Right? That's how cars are built. It's how almost everything is manufactured. Our organizations also tend to be structured in this kind of way. We have business analyst departments and design and solution architects, engineers, quality assurance, and operations. They tend to be headed by some sort of functional expert. The person who understands how to do business analysis the best tends to lead that function. And over time, you tend to look at the cost of running these functions, and some consultant will come and tell you can save a whole bunch of money by getting your quality assurance done in a low-cost location or something. And companies tend to obsess over processes, and they tend to obsess over roles and responsibilities in your net revenue rather than creativity, customers, and collaboration. Now, if you look at any of these internet companies, they look nothing like this today. If you look at how they're organized, they're a bit more like this. The teams are not functionally aligned. What we tend to create with these kind of companies is small cross-functional teams. We try and get the smallest number of people we need to be able to understand customer pain, to be able to build the solution and get it out there and iterate. We try and break down these organizational silos, because as soon as you've got hundreds of people involved in something, the cost of orchestrating is far too difficult. So we tend to try and organize ourselves in this way. The first question I often get asked here when I talk about these cross-functional teams is, what does a manager do? And actually, this is the biggest challenge for people who join these internet-era companies from more traditional companies. If they're a manager, their life fundamentally changes. They're no longer the functional expert who knows how to get it done. The role of a manager is about setting strategic direction and giving intellectual freedom. It's about making sure the teams understand which hill they're climbing, what their North Star is, and making sure they deal with all the interpersonal issues. They're a coach, and they make sure that team's got everything it needs. If it needs another designer, pull them in. If it doesn't, swap them for somebody else who's more valuable. It's actually, I believe, 10 times more difficult to be a manager in this type of company because it's chaotic, but it's also 10 times more rewarding. So the first trait that I think is true of these internet companies is they're organized for autonomy. This is about people over process. It's about cross-functional over specialist silos, and it's about managers in particular enabling and empowering rather than commanding and controlling. But it's not just that. Something else that you can observe in a lot of these internet companies is they have this belief in moving fast and breaking things. This is actually posted, was all over Facebook for years. It was actually part of their initial kind of pitch deck when it first started to IPO. They were very proud of this. And if you spend time, I spent time in most of the big companies now, they all have this belief that there is value in velocity, moving fast, being risk takers. The opposite of that is what I'd term death by committee. And we've all been there. I believe committees are generally where ideas go to die. I would love someone to come and tell me a time when they took an idea to a committee and it was debated and averaged and everything, and the idea got better. I just don't think that's how creativity works. Almost all research tells us that creativity works best with constraints. Actually, most internet-era companies tend to spend an awful lot of their time optimizing for reducing the gap between idea and execution. We ruthlessly automate things, not to reduce costs, but just to shorten that gap. My software engineers get frustrated if it takes more than 5 minutes from them changing some software to be able to see that out in the wild. We have these change freeze days. We have a beer cart every Friday, and the biggest complaint I ever get is the fact that we have these change freeze days. There's 6 of them a year where they're not allowed to deploy software, and they think this is completely unacceptable. I try and tell them what it used to be like when I built software shipped on CDs, and we shipped once a year. And they just don't believe me. But there is this deep belief in these internet companies that velocity has a value in its own right, and you should do whatever you possibly can to shorten the gap between idea and execution. But it's not just about execution. The real velocity that you care about is the velocity in learning. Every 2 weeks, I get together with my leadership team, and we look at, are we learning fast enough? And often the answer is, we could do better. And it started with making sure we had the right teams with the right goals set up with the right people. Then it was like, well, can we automate a whole bunch of these tasks to shorten the gap of just execution? But learning is often more than that. We're in the process of building our kind of next generation of tools, which we want to be the best in the world for marketers. And to do that, we need to deeply understand marketers' pain and what they go through day to day so we can fulfill their hopes and dreams and make our tools fun to use. So we thought, well, this is easy. We just need to recruit some marketers and take them on this journey with us. That proved pretty difficult. Getting marketers, say, look, come on this journey with us, join our alpha program. Turns out a lot of marketers don't really want to. They haven't got the time in the day. So I thought, well, this is easy. All we need to do is we need to incentivize. I said, look, we'll give you $100,000 of free advertising, but just let us run for it. We'll come and sit in your offices. We just want to learn. We'll make this thing get better all the time. Turns out that made people even more skeptical. So then I thought, well, I just need to incentivize the salespeople at Quantcast. So I'm sorry if you've suddenly had someone, a Quantcast rep, come and pitch you on being one of our alpha or beta partners. That was completely my fault, because I thought that was where the challenge lay. But eventually, we did find some customers who wanted to partner with us. And so they started kind of helping us develop some of these solutions. But very quickly, another problem emerged. We were wanting to try 10, 20 different ideas a week about how we could reach and influence people. What did measurement mean? And, how could we punch through the noise in the open internet? And the decision-making cycle was too long. Genuinely true story, we were wanting to just change some fairly basic parameters, and one of our customers there who we were running free advertising for said, I'm sorry, I need to run this by my VP of digital marketing. He insists on signing off every targeting change. We wanted to try fundamentally different personalized creatives. Another company told us, the CMO insists on seeing everything before it goes out. This was too slow. So we thought again about this. How can we increase this velocity of learning? And believe it or not, it's actually been cheaper for us to build a series of real companies that we own ourselves in order to be able to test what works or not. Here's an example of one. These are terrible companies. This is Doggy Bandanas. This one's called Quandana. It's a terrible website, but we sold hundreds of these things, right? Mainly to Texans, it turns out. They love a doggy bandana. But these days, it's actually cheaper for us to learn by launching a series of companies. The stuff gets shipped from China. We built the websites over the weekend. And this has enabled us to have this velocity in learning that we needed. Right? So the second trait, I think, is true of these internet-era companies, is they're optimized for the velocity of learning. We're ruthless in our automation of execution. We empower individuals to act. And we're about validation over deliberation. It's not about reducing everything to one big idea. It's about saying, hey, why not? Let's try it and see if it happens. The third point I'd like to make is actually a point that my friend Darren, who I met at that NCT group, a thought experiment he took me on that night. I said, well, how do you convince these large companies to kind of change the way that they act? And he said, well, I'm going to take you on this thought experiment now, so relax your shoulders a little bit, get into the mood. Imagine that you're at a pool party in Miami, and the sun's beating down, and there's a DJ by the pool, and there's cocktails being served. And all of your best people are there. And you feel a little bit hot, but the pool looks so refreshing. And you've got your Love Island body. I've never watched Love Island, but I'm told it's a thing. And you're feeling confident, and you go to dive into the pool. And somehow, miraculously, you've executed this perfect dive. And you're feeling really good. And just as your fingertips enter the water, you open your eyes, and you see a turd floating in the pool. The moral of this story is that it only takes one guy to shit in the pool to ruin a pool party. And yet, so many companies and so many people in some fairly traditional companies thinks their value they bring is in throwing water on ideas, in shitting on things. One of the fundamental traits that I've seen that's different about these internet-era companies is that they're fearlessly optimistic. There are not people there who think it is their job to point out all the reasons it might not work. The culture is generally one of saying, why not? Let's give it a go. How can we see if it works or not? So why am I telling you all of this? When I was originally asked to do this talk, they said, well, hey, can't you just tell us what the agency of the future is going to look like? And as we learned earlier, predicting the future is really difficult. But I think we can see some patterns, and we can learn from these traits. I believe the agency of the future is organized for autonomy. I think it's insane to split the hopes, dreams, and fears of the brands from the people who can kind of come up with amazing creatives from the executional powerhouse and concentrate on processes and roles and responsibilities. I think it would be much more valuable to have those people incentivized together, to be climbing a hill together, and to feel like a team. I think they're optimized for velocity. I think they will ruthlessly automate and use the best tooling in the world they can possibly find that enables them to learn. And I think they have to be fearlessly optimistic. Thank you very much.